I knew that Piers Roberts started something remarkable in the UK called Designer's Block because in 2010, I was a part of it. That year, days before I got married, I was in London curating a group show of handpicked female designers and artists called What Women Make. This was kind of like the pinnacle of that period of my life where I produced this group show as part of a larger show called Designer's Block. And I was surrounded by just immense talent throughout this venue and throughout the city of London. It took place in a disused building south of the Thames. It was filled with industrial designers, furniture designers, lighting designers, inventors, artists, all of the highest order, as was the entire show across the city called the London Design Festival. And I can assure you nothing in the US is as great. And unlike Milan's Salon de Mobile, which is this very impressive global center of design, everybody goes to Salon de Mobile to shop. And it's absolutely amazing. But the London Design Festival is very different. The Salon de Mobile feels more like a trade show in its centrality and immensity. But this feels more like a celebration of talent, and it really brings the city to life. It's not like a craft fair or a trade show of just commercially viable things like you'd find at the Jacob Javits Center in New York or like the Atlanta Gift Show. This is about the highest aesthetics. Visionaries in the entire city as a backdrop supporting this goal. And the UK has such a strong, beautiful history of maker culture. William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, to Terence Conran and his playful conceptual design aesthetic. And in this interview, you'll get to hear a bunch of just these luminary names of people from London and from all over Europe that Piers Roberts has touched in some way. What I didn't know about Piers Roberts and Designer's Block and all of British design is that it fit into a larger narrative of a fight for creative freedom and individuality. And I'm taking a break from politics this week to share this amazing interview with you. I'm positive that you will learn a lot that you did not already know, no matter where you sit in terms of your exposure to the design world. And if it's nothing, this will be utterly fascinating. If you are deeply entrenched in the design world, this will be utterly fascinating. Take a listen.
I didn't know anything about design at school. Creativity was being good at drawing, and it was also seen as very much less than the hard subjects of maths and physics and chemistry and things like that. Within the schooling I went to, which was the English public school system, it was all about you're creating the leaders for the future. And public schools were set up in order to create business leaders and people that would oversee the empire. And this was drawn from 5% of the population who were from that social class at the top. So all of these ideas around patriarchy, male leadership, white power, all of these things were part of the system that was about educating 5% of the British population to rule the world.
Welcome to Actual People, a podcast hosted by me, Chauncey Zalkin, dedicated to meaningful conversations about the evolving landscape of our lives and the power of our own creativity and imagination to make magic. Yep. Okay.
And then you get this sort of, if you take boys into an all-boy environment, then what do they know about women? If you take boys into an environment that's very hierarchical and especially 13 to 18 based around bullying, which was absolutely all the way through, then you create the foundation for the officers in the army who won't mind sending their men into battles where they'll die. And of course, you know, when you're looking at women's role, it was about producing boys to send to battle to win wars.
I saw The Wall by Pink Floyd.
There you go.
You know, right?
How fucked up it all is, and you know, sort of.
Doesn't that resonate with you? The Wall.
It's really nice to hear you say it, because I mean, it was incredibly viscerally different to anything else when the wall came out. Immediately, it triggers. I mean, for me, boarding school is all about brutalism and trauma. The woman who invented the term neurodiversity, Judy Singer, she has a little catchphrase. She says, "The schoolyard bully could identify autism for generations." Did you know I was diagnosed autistic? But yeah, you see, this is one of the things that really helped to make things make sense.
You are not the only person that I know from the UK that I've spoken to recently that is a creative brilliant person who has also been recently diagnosed neurodivergent, and that has helped her. A lot of these things are also superpowers.
Yeah. And the superpowers is a sort of curious label because people will say, well, what's the point of having a superpower if nobody will give you a job? In order to use your special skills, the well-being side is really crucial because part of the sort of getting out of the designer's block world and all of that was the realization that mentally I was completely screwed up. And, you know, the stage at which you have the breakdown is not entirely clear, but the sort of persevering and the self-harming behaviors and the confusions and the not being able to generate work and the sort of realizing the little triggers that have people go, oh, he's a bit odd, maybe it's easier to leave him alone. When you created the bloody world that created their space in order to exist. And this is what's incredibly nuts about the work we did at Designers Block was how prescient it was and how much it led the way and how things that simply didn't exist are now, of course you do that.
Like what?
That was a time when I think the creative as entrepreneur, the term creative entrepreneur didn't come about till then. It was a sort of designer maker. But the social factors that led to what I was doing were.
What were you doing? Because now I'm recording for a podcast, so just tell me.
Okay.
What did
Well,
like give us a background on what is Designer's Block?
So Designer's Block was the desperate attempt to salvage the investment I made into the most exciting shop that ever opened in the old Truman Brewery and created the spark for East London and super cool spaces and things like that. I invested what was the equivalent of a 120 square meter apartment in EC1 that's worth a few million into opening a shop that would bring together all the work of the designers emerging in the late 90s from the UK, the Netherlands in particular, and Scandinavia. And what I saw was coming from a social science background of a generation looking to do something hopeful, optimistic, and a little bit punk ethic in a way that created this new design thing. The factors that drove that were the economic recession in the 90s. There wasn't really much money around. The moving of manufacturing out of Europe to China, which meant there weren't manufacturers to produce your work. And a simple fact that the reward that you got from designing stuff for a manufacturer or brand wasn't all that great. So the terms of business weren't great. So without investment, without manufacturers, without a good reward model, if you've got the same number of graduates coming out of design schools as exist across the entire UK industry, what do? You do things for yourself. You invest in yourself. This is where the idea that the creative becomes the driver of their own business begins. You had the fashion world.
Because they were disgruntled or not getting the work. It wasn't enough work.
They didn't have enough choice. And contemporary design had become quite boring in some ways. And you could probably say the same now. But there was a sense that contemporary design fitted. Well, okay, so 85% of contemporary design coming out of Italy at that time was sold in Germany. So in April, you had the Salone del Mobile, where you presented the ideas. And in January, you sold them at the International Furniture Fair of Cologne. And so the season for contemporary design was Milan for ideas, January in Cologne for sale. So 85% was being sold. So you had family-based manufacturing in Italy, backed by Milan being the center of publishing. So you created the magazines to tell the story, and that's why it's so crucial. That's the fundamental difference between Milan and say Torino. And then you got family-based retail and distribution in Germany. So the whole thing was based around a business model of family to family, Italy to Germany. But what came later was all sorts of other countries then going, oh, we quite like the idea of being contemporary design. And you've got the beginnings of what becomes creative exports as soft power. People think of Britain as super cool, or they didn't until Brexit when it suddenly nosedived. But up till that time, it's because of the music, the fashion, the art, and design, which didn't exist as contemporary design in the UK. It just didn't exist in that period, except for a tiny, tiny, tiny margin, suddenly began to come about. And so you had your Ron Arrads, your Tom Dixons, your Jasper Morrisons being famous designers employed by these manufacturers and brands abroad. but there really wasn't a
What
market.
year did Tom Dixon and that group become
The
like,
mid 90s, the mid 90s, you're
and
talking.
what do you think, what made that change? Because when I came, I was like, oh, this is all, there's so much design in the UK. That's
Well,
how I felt. And I was there 2007, 2008. I said,
I don't
they're the,
it's me, but that would be slightly exaggerated. But I definitely had a part of it. So what changed? IKEA came around about that time, and suddenly you had contemporary design that's cheap coming from IKEA, and they had a whole marketing strategy, an advertising campaign, chuck out your chintz. So up until that time, chintz, old velvet fabrics, dark sofas, heavy stuff, carpets, this was what the home was about. And when you're talking about the British elite, this was antiques, this was shooting grouse, this was leather patches on elbows.
I can't help but connect this boarding school bullying patriarchal thread and heavy design, a coat of arms, the legacy of your family
No, no,
with,
no, you're absolutely going to the right place. You're talking about the shift in the British story. Pirate radio came about in the 60s. There was Radio Caroline that was based on a ship 2 to 3 miles off the coast of Britain. The territorial waters stopped there. They used these old structures built in the Second World War for when they wanted to bomb London. The whole of the UK was in blackout, so no lights on, no curtains, everything dark. So Guy Maunsell had the idea that they should build these structures in the Thames that would have great big guns on top. These towers became where young guys would create their own radio stations, and this was known as pirate radio. This was the first time when kids were going, we're bored of the BBC. The BBC is the voice of Britain. It's all received English and welcome to the Queen. It was all about Britain controlling the narrative. The upper classes, it was about the empire. You're looking at the beginnings of the end of empire when nations around the world are going like, fuck off, and claiming for independence. When you're looking at control systems, Britain isn't this wonderful place of freedom. Britain is emerging out of the war, having to rebuild, voting for the Labour Party. Like, actually, the war has affected everybody's life. We should be looking at social democracy as a way forward where we look at health and well-being and housing and all of those sorts of things. But it's still fundamentally a conservative country with a small c and a big C. Small c, old ways of thinking, big C, politically dominated by the Tory party forever. The pirate radio was the first attempt to say, sod you, we want to tell our own story. We want to play records that are coming out in America, which aren't getting airtime on the BBC. And we want to do this. And of course, then they had to exist outside the territorial waters of the UK in order not to get locked down.
I grew up on the movie Tommy
Yes.
from The
Yeah.
Who and The Wall. My mother had an English boyfriend for 20 years, starting in my childhood, and his father was a World War II test pilot. And so I heard a lot of these stories about boarding school from him. I have a general sense of this. I think of it as later on, the Manchester Sound
Yeah.
that came
So
after
that's
Margaret
also how
Thatcher.
you
And
are. Yeah, and and all the time, all the way you're going through, you're looking at these pockets of resistance, this attempt to do your own thing, and there's that whole heritage. So you've got the punk era, you've got
Vivian Westwood and
exactly, and then you get the fashion industry in the 90s, and this
uh,
is when the young British artists were coming about. And then you had this idea of Britcool and Tony Blair taking it up, who came into power in 97. And then in 98, the term creative industries is coined. That's the year that I began. And at the time, there were about 3 contemporary design stores in the UK.
so this whole podcast is about trying to understand where to thrive in the creative industries. That's what my big question is, what's going on with them and what we can do next and what happened to things that started to get lost. And now I feel like you're a key to understanding this. Tell me a little bit more about the time that the term creative industries was coined.
There was a Labour MP called Chris Smith, who is probably the only MP who really wanted the job of DCMS, which is Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And in the years running up to the election of Tony Blair in 97, there was an attempt to say, look, there are all these industries that in and of themselves are quite small, but if you add them together, become something quite sizable. And this includes advertising, design, architecture, film, fashion, all of these sorts of areas.
Furniture design, arts and crafts, all that.
Yeah. Well, the arts and crafts movement, I guess, would be in that. So crafts, heritage things of those sorts, which again, you can trace that back to the 1850s and liberal attempts at progression. And so the whole pre-Raphaelite movement and all of
I mean,
these.
there's a legacy in the UK of beautiful design and creativity.
Yeah. Which really you see now in terms of craft brewing, high quality butchers, creatives running their own business. But this is creative people deciding to invest in themselves. This is creative people saying, nobody's going to invest in me. They don't understand my ideas. They're not willing to give me a good deal. I better do it for myself. But the emergence of the creative as the driver of business comes with the work that I guess I'm doing in that period. Because when you're looking at fashion and art, art has always had the distribution model where it's dominated by galleries. And fashion is about magazines and high-end couture and models and sexy, sexy photography. But the idea of the designer coming up with an object that isn't as boring as the shit we're being offered, isn't as dry as the contemporary design that's coming in lots of places, and is more quirky and interesting, is being led by the Dutch. And then it's in the UK, you've got Tom Dixon, who was absolutely a pioneer. You had Ron Arad and Jasper Morrison being employed by the bigger brands and doing their different things. But the Dutch were definitely leading the way, and there were interesting things going on in Scandinavia. So we were picking up on stuff happening in Sweden and Finland, and to a certain, and Norway was still behind. Norway would start to invest in contemporary design from around about 2000, 2001. Until that time, Norway had always basically been an agricultural economy that hit wealth when it hit oil in the North Sea. But those things have happened really, really changed. But the idea that you're looking at contemporary design as a way of signifying cultural values within the nation is very much there. So there was a woman called Penny Spark who was at the RCA, and she wrote a book about how you photograph design and how that represents different philosophical approaches. So she would say from the ceiling you would hang a bit of Italian design that would suggest its sort of philosophical foundations and how it was all about expressing an aesthetic idea. And you can already see the body movements coming into the way that it was done.
Mm-hmm.
German design, which was about function, you would photograph it from the front, and it would show how it works. So, you know, sort of, this is how it works. Here are all the knobs and buttons. Whereas in Scandinavia, you would photograph it within the home, which was about suggesting that contemporary design was about the quality of life within the family and in the home. And Britain didn't really have very much because we didn't buy any. The only contemporary design that was being sold at that time in the UK would be in a business that wanted its front office to look like it was progressive and its boardroom to look like it was doing something interesting. But nobody had it in its home. There were no showrooms for contemporary design that would be sold to the architectural community that existed at the ground floor because there was no ground floor audience. You would only be on the first floor. And there were like 3 or 4 contemporary design stores. So if you had money, you bought antiques.
What were those big design stores then? We're talking about the late 90s.
Conran was the main one. And of course, his influence has been phenomenal across the whole British design. He then created Habitat, which is a kind of spin-off that was cheaper than Conran. You've got Heels at the top of Tottenham Court Road, and Tottenham Court Road was always a sort of centre for furniture and the design. So that springs off of Oxford Street. And there was a guy called Andrew Purvis who had a shop called Purvis and Purvis, which was probably the only place where you could do contemporary design if you were somebody like me making furniture and saying, I'd like to sell it in a store. They were just about the only ones. And then you had SCP, which is Sheridan Coakley Products, who was the first person to produce design by Jasper Morrison, Konstantin Grcic, Matthew Hilton, these sorts of characters, the characters that would become the sort of main players in that top 20 designers that every brand uses because then it's easy for the marketing people to sell.
Yeah.
And this was happening around it. But that was about it. You then look at East London, and East London was, well, you've got the City of London, which is the richest square mile in the country, not in the world, apart from Wall Street. And then next door to it, you've got 2 boroughs of Tower Hamlets, where the Truman Brewery is, and Hackney, which becomes this super cool place. And they have, for 100 years, been the poorest boroughs in the country. So you have this sort of next doorness of incredible wealth and incredible poverty. And Brick Lane has been the stepping off point for immigrants for 400 or 500 years. And there's a building in Brick Lane that has been two types of Christian church, a synagogue and a mosque. And it's the only building to have served all three. It's still there. It's basically Jewish owned and it's Bengali occupied now. It's also where there's a famous Cable Street riots in 1936 or something like that, when Oswald Mosley, who was attempting to be the Hitler of the UK, took a great big marching rally up through Brick Lane with all these Jewish immigrants. And all the Jewish immigrants took their pots from under their bed and threw them over the heads of everybody and they dispersed. And it's still celebrated as this sort of wonderful rejection of fascism from within an immigrant community
We
in
need that
London.
here. We need that here now.
Yeah, you do. But I'll try and tell you, God, the American thing is odd. And you're not allowed to comment on it if you're not American, are you? You get
What?
abused.
That's not true.
Don't you think so? You usually get told.
No, I think that we're desperate for help
Oh, of course you are, but
and
that doesn't mean.
support and emotional support.
Yeah, and it's really sort of. I mean, I know we're off on another tangent, but I mean, I'm progressive, but you're left with a sort of binary choice, and I think what I
Yeah.
try to do sometimes is to understand those who I don't understand. So where do I go in order to try to figure out what's going on?
We're so big and we don't have neighboring countries we can learn from and hear their languages. Europe is almost city state in its
Mm.
geographic makeup. So it has a forced exposure to other cultures. People do not travel. They're not exposed to global cultures. There's a real failure in our educational system.
Christian,
Um,
Christian as well. I mean, which seems shocking the degree to which Christianity
oh
dominates.
yeah. We're a very puritanical culture with a lack of education and exposure to critical thinking about the world and no global context. They use religion as a proxy for information and data, and it's really toxic. I live in the South now, and I have become over time, I noticed, resistant to religion, where there was some more of a place for it for me, for, Christianity. Now I bristle at it. It makes me
But
very
religion has been,
uncomfortable.
isn't it crazy that something as amazing as discussing the meaning of life and what happens to us and the stars and the universe comes down to essentially narrow parameters of what you can or can't do within a social community? And it's dictated by the bloke who's wearing the right collar.
I mean,
You
that
had,
stuff came from you guys with Calvinism, and
well, of course.
that's your
But
fault.
then you had the town and you had the squire, who was the country gentle person who oversaw the area. The younger brother would become the priest. The older brother would inherit the estate, and the younger brother would become a priest. If you've got less scope to spread information, then you end up with local areas of control and organization. This was run by the upper classes, who were the landowners, and then everybody did what they were told or were corralled into that. And then you had the priest that said, well, if we need a view on morality, then we need to do that. But of course, that separation and integration was quite a fascinating way of creating social order. And what we have at the moment is a failure of any system to create a social order that allows for the autonomy that maybe people are desperately after.
For divergent views, because now it's all on a binary. You either think this or that. And I don't feel like I'm fitting in as much to either one.
This is why binary to me is the fundamental issue. And then we're going back to Silicon Valley, where everything is written in binary code. We definitely go down. And my own work is called, and trinary is like 1 + 1 is 3, which is like one and the other and the relationship between the two. So it's like the yin and the yang, seeming opposites are interconnected and interdependent, order and chaos. Too much order or too much chaos both lead to chaos.
Where we are right now as a society, we're very uncomfortable with that nuance and gray area. I want to take it back to the late 90s and the coining of the term creative industries and how Designer's Block started as a result of that or along with that, and how that honestly ties into the way the creative industry has gone a little bit awry as of late, and how you think we can get back on track and what role maybe AI plays in that, or doesn't play in that, and how that all sort of ties into the social structure and people feeling out of sorts and disconnected and poor and fed up and all the other things.
Okay. To me, it was coincidental that I opened my shop at the same time that the term creative industries was coined, but maybe it's not. There were certainly social factors driving changes that I picked up on sooner than anybody and did something about. And when I look back on it now, being autistic, I recognize that it was an autistic trait to see things before others. And I imagined everybody else could see this. And I didn't realize that they couldn't. But that's quite a strong autistic thing. I'd also work through what I might like to do in all sorts of layers and detail, which is kind of what sometimes critique for being obsessional thinking. But if I hadn't done that, would I have come up with this idea? Would I have worked out to place it in an area that would become the perfect place to strike the match that lit this whole East London becomes the coolest place on the planet, and it's all about youth and ideas, exciting stuff, having a go and making use of empty spaces? Well, to an extent, I understood that, and I had all sorts of layers in my thinking that drove it. To a certain extent, I was incredibly blind to certain things. I really didn't know how to run a shop. I didn't really know what I was doing. It wasn't like I'd been working in the sector for ages. I'd got involved with a big show for a museum in Cologne that opened in January 96 that was called Highlights Design from Great Britain at the Museum für Angewandte Kunst in Cologne during the Cologne Furniture Fair. And that's what got me to meet this new generation of designers that were coming through. There was Inflate, there was Jan, there was Tom Dixon, there was Simon Pengelly, there was Ron Arad, Jasper Morrison, all of these sorts of characters, Ross Lovegrove and all of these sorts of people. And they're all in one place, and the world was very small. So you could run a party, which I would do in due course, with 100 people, and you would have everybody in the sector in one place. It was tiny, 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 tiny. But it also meant it was very condensed. There were very few publications that were out there. The Guardian did a little guide on a Friday that would talk about it. Elle Decoration sort of existed. Blueprint was the main magazine, and they were the ones with whom I partnered in order to get people to come along to my shows. But the Truman Brewery, instead of this sort of 11-acre vibrant everything going on, all these things that happen, was empty, apart from about 200 people that were either artists, doing bits in fashion, lots of music producers and performers. So I had people like Talvin Singh DJing for me, and we'd wander up and down Brick Lane, and there were all these extraordinary characters that were there in this tiny little space, because the world of contemporary London cool all existed within this really condensed little space. And I just thought, isn't that amazing? And I thought, well, I'm never going to be a designer because that's not how I work. But maybe I could do something to promote this. And I thought, isn't it obvious? Surely if I open this shop, everybody's going to go, wow, isn't that amazing? Then they go buy all my furniture and I'll make lots of money and it will be great. And so I sort of expanded it until it became this 250 square meter, 2,500 square foot shop and exhibition space that blew the world away. It absolutely, totally caught fire in terms of people's imagination. Wayne Hemingway, who started Red or Dead, was doing a breakfast thing with Chris Evans, who did the Big Breakfast. And every week he'd come to my shop to get things out to display within his, this is contemporary design, is an exciting bit. And every week we would be having our work picked up by the magazines. Graham Norton, who's ridiculously famous now, bought his very first contemporary design from my shop. And he'd sort of come in and get, oh, I didn't realize I had to wait 6 weeks. So we ended up packing away his thing, giving it to him. And then he'd do this beautiful cover on Radio Times, draped across. He was very successful. He was on a Mark Newson, the first bit that Mark Newson ever did that was like spun plastic. And so these were, you know, Mark Newson goes on to be #2 at Apple under Johnny Ive as a designer. And he was doing his very first design product in the UK in my shop in this area. And he was based out of Australia and being picked up in Japan.
I'm so glad that you're sharing this. This is so, I didn't even know all of this background, and it's awesome.
This is incredible time. And I ran this party and everybody came along and I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, here am I never go to parties because I don't know what to do and I don't know what goes on. And I became the world's greatest design festival, architecture festival, party organizer, number one. And if you looked at the
Because you were
20,
just going on pure instinct, right?
it is pure instinct, but you also, because I just been given a talk about being neurodivergent and the qualities that come with that, and we were kind of trying to assess what were the autistic qualities that you normally get disparaged for that were crucial for me to be able to do what I did at that time and through those periods. I originated the idea of using big empty buildings for shows. There was no property developer that had ever used a building for public shows. There'd been the occasional fashion show,
Like the
but
pop-up shop? Like, is that the precursor to pop-up shops?
it's the precursor to pop-up shops, and
Yeah.
pop-up would be there. Before the development, you run a range of activities in order to landmark the space, in order to bring public in order to talk about the plans, in order to reach out to the community and ask what you're doing. That had never happened. So the Tea Building, which is Shoreditch House, which was Derwent Valley, first people they ever did shows with me. City of London, richest organisation in the world, first shows they ever did, me. They got me along to negotiate for them to have something with somebody else. And I sorted out the entire thing between two parties. And at the end of it, they turned around and they said, oh, well, if we ever get anything weird come up, we'll get in touch with you again. And I'm like, I've just fucking sorted everything out. And you still call me weird and dismiss me. It's not.
Well, okay, so that also goes back to before we were recording, you were talking about anybody who's creative has been dismissed.
I did a T-shirt once that said, everyone hates a pioneer. Because they do. They think they like pioneers. And this is still the case. People think they like pioneers, but they generally like pioneers 20 years after they did the really interesting stuff.
I was always a pioneer, and I would complain that things weren't working out for me. And my dad's like, pioneers, they always come back with arrows in their ass, which is obviously very racist. So I don't think I wonder if I could say that in a different way. But from his context of how he grew up,
Yeah.
like obviously, like that's not
People
exactly
always
how.
look at you and they'll say, what on earth are you on about?
I was the very first person who did street style blogging. I had this thing called Girl on the Street in my 20s. I had a team of women all over the world, young girls, who would write about stuff, but mostly I did. I take pictures of this huge digital camera on the street at Fashion Week on people on the street. I hand coded HTML. There was no blogging software. And as soon as Blogger came out, the first blogging software, I stopped. I said, oh, now everyone's going to do it. Forget it. And I never made money off of it. And other people came and made money and I didn't. And I was really frustrated by that. I don't talk about it very often because I don't want to seem dated or bitter. But I was a pioneer of street style blogging, that kind of cultural reporting on the street. I wasn't totally accepted into the fashion world exactly. I was like kind of like this weird girl that did this stuff, and I didn't have a real place. But I had followers and people who liked what I did, but it never turned into money. I was very early. I was very early.
You do need a different mindset to be the main player in a market than the mindset that is good at being the pioneer. And you do. And people who can do both, that's quite remarkable.
I do think can do both.
There are people who do, and also I think you can learn from it as well, but you can get paranoid about it. I mean, there were opportunities that could have come my way, which because I was fearful of everybody nicking what I was doing, I didn't go along with. And I didn't know how to form the commercial relationships that could have led to me being a superstar all over the world. But there were definitely the opportunities, especially in Southeast Asia. And I fucked them up. And again, that comes back to a sort of autistic trait of going, I don't understand what's going on. I feel that people are taking my ideas. Nobody's giving me credit. Obsessionally going over and over and over and over it. And then, boom, bang, crash, smash, destroy. And then you get the meltdowns and the breakdowns and the pain and the hurt that comes with all of that, the trauma.
What was the smash crash that happened to you?
Probably around about 2004. I've been doing a London Design Festival for 5 years, and then the London Design Festival comes along, and the last thing they want is to pretend that I started it. So I'm already being excluded by the people who are coming along in order to run the London Design Festival. I'd find out years later, somebody would say, in order to run a festival, you need the 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps are politics, patronage, and partners. And of course, I hadn't got a clue how to deal with the politics. And the people who run the London Design Festival were totally politics. I didn't have a clue how to do the patronage and get the sponsors, the people to pay for it. And they would know more how to do that. But the partners, the kids growing up going, how do I do my thing? What am I going to do? How's it going to do? I designed the space where they had the peer group learning. Everybody saw creatives being unable to do business. Where 1+1 is 3. You can be creative and you can do business, and the relationship is incredibly vibrant and exciting. But by and large, people in business go, oh, it's all very well having these ideas, but business is the serious stuff. And so creativity is trivialized within the decision making of organizations that have access to resources. And this is still the problem that we've got today, is that in a world of uncertainty, people think the answer is to create more order and control. 2008 was a massive change when you're looking at these shifts, because it was the end of the time of experimentation.
That's when I met you.
Just when things started going wrong. Sort of
You might be interested in my impression. 2010 is when I did Designer's Block.
Right.
Yes, 2010. And then I left Europe after that. They're not correlated. It was actually a necessity that I needed to work, and I had to go back to New York. My impression was that Designer's Block was the best of the London Design Festival, the most edgy, most interesting stuff. And that's why I wanted to be part of that. I loved the London Design Festival, but the big venue was the more safe, commercialized stuff.
Yes.
There's a lot of great stuff from other places too, yes, but Designer's Block was beautiful things and interesting things that light a fire under me. I have a visceral physical reaction to the things that are very ugly. I get headaches and nauseous with ugly things. I can't be in a very corporate office with fluorescent lights. It causes depression. When I found that kind of design thread in different cities that hit the right spot for me, I felt a sense of hope and optimism and like, this is where I want to be. I get energy from that. And so it makes me sad to hear that that was sort of taken away from you, or that you felt like you didn't quite fit in, and that it takes fitting in, because that ruins it. I mean, I find that to be the pinnacle of successful life, is things are very beautiful and creative and have that spark. And if it's missing, I think that it signals something very bad for society. That might sound like an overstatement, but I really feel like that's true.
Well, I mean, firstly, thank you. I mean, that's a beautiful way of, because it's been quite hard, you know, when things fall apart, often remembrance of things are formed by how they end. If things end badly, then we imagine the whole thing was bad, and we forget how beautiful and extraordinary and amazing, how impactful it was.
Well, how to end badly?
Well, it's just that you carry on for too long and you're fed up and there's no more buildings left and nobody cares. And it was actually Sheridan Coakley, I remember one day turning around and going, oh, your show for young designers. And I thought, that's just about the most trivial thing that you could possibly say to sum up Designer's Block, when it had all these layers. But if a brand is what people think it is, then we'd reached that point where the differentiation and the layers had become blurred. It's a bit like you've got this beautiful, lovely sort of cast copper thing, and somebody's rubbed it with metal wool for ages until all the edges have gone. There were so many beautiful edges and layers to what we were doing that I don't think people understand. The motivation for doing the show, partly it was from Milan. So Milan had the trade show in the trade hall and the ideas in the city. And that's the starting point for every creative festival ever since. Milan, that actually developed out of developing social housing from different political backgrounds, actually, and then became the design fair, but that's another story. But the idea that you would have the trade show and then complement it with the ideas in the city was what I was learning from. We had 100% design that was the design show. The international journalists, and if there were any buyers, would come to London at that time, because that's where what is this brick called? Who are these young designers? What are they doing? Where are they going to be? They would come to 100% design.
Yeah, that's the big venue, right?
The biggest venue that we had at the time, which was, And I thought, well, that's the obvious time to do this other show. So I'd opened this shop. It'd been absolutely amazing. And I realized within a few weeks that we were going to go bust, because people were going to come and they were going to love it. So it's the most amazing thing. They weren't going to spend the money. You really only have a few weeks before you suddenly realize that you're under this incredible financial pressure and it's all going to go horribly wrong. And here you are, a fool again, an idiot again, a mistake again. And you can't live on the basis of people saying, this is absolutely exciting, and then buggering off home and nothing happening. So are you just going to sort of create this wonderful firework and then it all dies and then you're in poverty and you're really depressed? or do you fight to do something more? We were going to have this Dutch show within the shop for the London Design Festival, and it was Caspar Vissers that was going to do it. And Caspar Vissers would end up running all of the Dutch designer, Marcel Wonders. So the whole Marcel Wonders thing is Caspar Vissers.
Mm.
And Caspar Vissers coordinates this show, which has got people like Helle Jongerius, Richard Hutton, Ineke Hans. I mean, you're talking about the most exciting designers of that generation in one space. And then the lift didn't work very well. And I thought, bloody hell, emptying the shop's going to be a pain. So I turned round to the family who owned the Truman Brewery and I said, well, you're doing up that big building over on the other side of the estate. Could we do a show in there at this time? And they said, yeah, okay. They'd never done a show like that before. We were the first contemporary store in the old Truman Brewery.
That's
then.
now known for what?
It's known for offbeat shows, quirky stores, and it's huge. It's 11 acres, it's vast, and it does incredibly well. But it's still using all the buildings that were part of the Truman Brewery.
There's still like that is the building where there's all these like market stalls downstairs and stuff, is it?
Yeah. It wasn't in that building. It was in another building that wasn't, but it was in there. And it was the first time it opened up Dray Walk, which is the road that's got coffee shop and all the things.
And they had these 3 different black paintings or something on the wall.
These are all there, yeah.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was just empty buildings. Just empty buildings. So again, we could.
What year is this?
98.
Okay, yeah.
So I said, how about we do this? I had a PR chap called Martin Evans and Suzanne Hind. He used to be head of PR for the Body Shop. They went over to America. He's now the most leading character for advising major property companies on pre-development and all of this. He's an extraordinary character, lovely character. And he said we should deal with Blueprint to get the people along. We opened in May or June. The show would come in September. And when we opened, we had no idea we were going to do this show. And this show would be the show that would change the world and give me work not very well paid for the next 16 years, but turned me into a super cool kid, cover of magazine stuff. I spent between probably June and July up until September pulling together all this work from Sweden, Finland, UK, amazing stuff, just extraordinary. It was like if you put every single person pretty well of that generation in one space at one time in a building that completely reconfigured what shows in big empty buildings and festivals is about, it happened in that show. And we'd had a rubbish summer, and then on September whatever, the 20th or what have you, 4,000 people showed up to the Truman Brewery and they went, oh my God. And Talvin Singh was DJing and things like that. We had people went into one of the exhibitors' room, undressed, folded their clothes, climbed up onto the roof naked and danced.
That's how you know you're a success.
Exactly. You know, obviously, right.
Boom. That's the moment.
And we then had 4 days of glorious sunshine, and people would come down Brick Lane on a Sunday to the Sunday market, and that was the only time they would come, because people wouldn't have gone there. They just wouldn't. And then they came across this show, and Blueprint had advertised it and promoted it, and it became this extraordinary thing. And all the international people that had gone to 100% design, well, what do we do with the rest of the time? They came over and they saw it, and then suddenly there was this amazing thing. But one of the logics that was there within my head, which I guess people forget about because it's so common now, was I wanted people to believe in the possibility that something that they knew nothing about might actually be more beautiful and more special than anything they'd come across before, which is kind of the whole point of design, isn't it? You question things, but then what are you going to offer in its place? And that's why I love it, is because it has to offer something.
Right. It gives you that hope and that feeling, okay, there's something there. Years before that, fashion was my thing. When I left New York and moved to Paris, I already had it in my head that I was starting to be more interested in housewares and design than I was in fashion design.
Yeah. Why it was that you sort of were shifting that way?
It's so long ago, but I had written it on a piece of paper that I didn't care about the same things I used to care about. I was about 30 years old and I left it on my desk. I was at an ad agency that had these 2 factions. I sat next to someone from the old guard and she wasn't very friendly. The 2 groups did not get along. And I left this little journal open with what I had written on it. And the next morning when I came in, she was a lot friendlier towards me. I noticed it and I looked down and I thought she must have read this. There was some vulnerability in it. She changed her whole demeanor ever after. Had something about design and the physical object. So I know I thought that way, but I hadn't moved to Europe yet.
Might ask to an extent, I mean, because fashion is very much about how you present externally, and design is about what you bring into your home and how you live.
I was more interested in creating my environment.
I think that there's something very different about the characters that were doing product and furniture than there was from people in the fashion world.
Yeah,
Because
how
in
would
the
you
fashion
define
world,
that?
it's very performance and design. You kind of maybe get these slightly more introvert, curious people, and then
It's
they
more
go,
intellectual. I think design is more intellectual. I was
okay,
interested in fashion in the first place because I liked couture and I liked street style, the two different things, because it
nice,
expressed who you were when you're in your 20s, you're
sure.
figuring out who you are. And that interested me. And I think because I'm in my 30s at that point, that I'm interested in a philosophical foundation in the design of the object.
Yeah. And again, that's just
I'm
in
also was a trend
culture.
spotter for a career. And I grew up in a household where my mother was very interested in the object. We had a lot of beautiful objects in our
Beautiful.
home.
Nice, which I didn't really have. For me, it was this sort of shocking alternative. Because I think through my 20s, I was sort of, I'd come out of public school and went, whatever the answer is to how things should be organized, it definitely shouldn't be posh white men. So I was looking at everything else. And I think this fascination with other is something that stems from there. And I think that's something that, you've referred to a little bit. It's like everybody's obsessed with themselves and their own group and building walls and not looking at other. And to me, the fascination with other is the most driving, beautiful, extraordinary thing in my life. And I'll make mistakes, I'll get things wrong, I'll explore, I'll maybe realize that I've sort of gone too far and maybe I would like to come back into a comfort space. And that's sort of all right. There's a project that I want to do called Cross the Line, which is how do we cross the line to meet the other? And how do we see that? And it was partly came from the school next door where my son was like, it's just ridiculously mixed. There wasn't a single kid in that year who had two white English parents, incredibly diverse. And we say we cross the line to go into the school and all the kids mix. And then we cross the line, we come back out and we all go into posh, white,
Mm,
creative European, poor white and
mm,
black. And then within the
mm.
black, African and West Indian or second,
Yeah.
third
People
generation
go
English.
back to their enclaves.
Some people find it difficult to cross the line. And at a certain point, we have to accept that that's okay. Some people are very easy crossing the line and they're really curious about it. And some people really struggle with that and they need that sort of emotional support of people like them.
Or they don't
Yeah.
feel welcome. There's also vulnerability. I don't think it's very exciting or interesting to constantly stay in your own comfort
Well,
zone. I
to
don't,
me, it's incredibly dull. And
yes,
also,
very.
so I was looking at a sort of name for something called On the Outside Looking Out, because I'm on the outside because I got pushed to the outside. It wasn't a choice. I was on the outside. It was very obvious to them way before it was obvious to me. And so somebody say, so you're on the outside. Are you on the outside looking in? And I thought for a moment and I thought, uh-uh. Oh, why would I look in? It's boring. It's dull. I mean, I'm on the outside. I'm looking out. So again, when we're looking at our pioneers, they're often people who have been excluded. They've been pushed to the outside. And then you're using your fascination with what else exists beyond that space. And you're using the natural abilities that you might have as an autistic person, maybe a pattern thinker. You can connect things in curious ways. You are interested in lots of different things, not just a sort of vertical silo thinking. And so you make connections that others don't. And that's where the really interesting stuff happens, is when something that works for everybody else that doesn't work for you, you reimagine in a way that nobody else could have conceived of, and then reveal that. And this is what I was doing with Designers Block in doing the shows. And this is what I think the whole neurodivergent community has to offer and is already offering and has so much more to contribute, is forced to the outside, you do something really fascinating and then maybe you bring it back, or maybe you go like, fuck you, I'm not doing this in order to satisfy your desire to allow me not to feel quite as miserable and traumatized by living in your neurotypical world. I'm actually going to do it for myself. And when I talk about this, it's like this is 15 to 20% of the population. That's a pretty big niche to market services towards, who are currently being let down by the provision of services that aren't empathetic to the needs of neurodivergent people. This is going to
See,
be
I don't know if
huge.
I'm neurodivergent. So you keep talking about being neurodivergent, and I do relate to almost everything that you are saying. I suspect I have ADHD, and I've been told by my therapists, by two therapists, that I should get that checked out. I'm very
Yeah, I wouldn't be all
overstimulated,
that.
and
I wouldn't be all that surprised. I mean, that's partly why we get on, and I find
yeah,
that
I'm like, everything you're, I'm like, yeah, I like conversations where it's like a ping pong, like boom, boom,
it has to
scraping the
be.
culture, and we're so interested. A lot of people are just not like that. And I don't think I've fully accepted that people just aren't that always as curious or as cerebral.
And I tell you my favorite metaphor for being autistic or ADHD, and it comes from a woman called Joanne Limburg, who's written these amazing books. I advise people on books written by neurodivergent people about being neurodivergent or coming to realize it. And this didn't happen 10 years ago. It was all medicalized versions of us, which we could talk about. But there's a woman called Joanne Limburg, and she's written a book called Letters to My Weird Sisters on autism and feminism. And I got to meet her afterwards, and she's wonderful. And she has this metaphor for being autistic. And she says, imagine a map of the UK, and on it, put the A roads. And the A roads are how neurotypical people go from place to place. That's how they communicate. That's how they get places. That's the way they go. That's how they understand it. It's all you travel on the A roads and you get from place to place. As an autistic person, you don't have any A roads. What you've got is a whole bunch of B roads, back roads, funny little lanes, cul-de-sacs, narrow tracks, strange little wandering places where you veer off and do things. And then what you also got is a few superhighways. So I will get told off because they're going, why can't you keep up? Why are you, what are you doing wandering down there? Why are you doing all, can't you see how it is? And I'm going, but don't you realize there's this amazing, like, little bit of, there's a bird down there that's migrating and it's fascinating. Or there's this little waterfall. And if you go down that track and you turn, it's amazing. And that's how I go with
Maybe
all,
they're the neurodivergent ones.
they're the odd ones. John Lennon said, people who aren't weird are really weird.
Right. That's, I'm like thinking, wait, maybe feel like,
why do we have to always submit to you? And this is again about dominant cultures. And dominant cultures presume that we're all the same. Because dominant cultures work in a certain way, they tell anybody off who doesn't fit within that. They then prioritize and promote people who are the same, which results in cognitive bias and sort of why they're so boring, because they're not self-critical. So they don't even realize it. And then if they're going to be nice to us, they think they're being really kind. The worst thing you can do to somebody who's normal is tell them how boring they are, or how they're not being kind or something like that, because it really freaks them out. But they don't realize how obstructed we are in a neurotypical world because we don't travel by A roads and they don't make sense to us. And if we say, I don't understand it, they assume it's because we're thick. Whereas we might be saying, I don't understand it because you haven't actually thought about it and there's a lot more subtlety to it.
somebody hurt my feelings once. This was such a long time ago, but sometimes it comes up. The guy, I just talked to him at a bar and talked to him one other time on the phone or something. And I was preparing for an interview or something, and I was probably in my late 20s or very early 30s. And he said something like, maybe you think that you're sophisticated and smart and have these great ideas, but really you're just full of nonsense and nobody understands what you're talking about because you're not making any sense. Something I might be, I'm getting it wrong, but that's how it sounded to
No,
me.
that sounds in
And
the
then I
spirit
thought,
of.
maybe he's right. Like maybe I'm making no sense. Maybe it's not that I'm clever, but that I'm convoluted and I don't know what I'm doing. But
This
do you
is
understand that? Like because I was
completely,
trying to,
completely. But what's happening is again, you're exploring layers and subtleties that aren't apparent to others, and then you are being blamed for exploring those things. And
because it confuses the listener.
yeah, and they really don't get it, and they think that conforming is the most crucial role. I mean, social conformity is the thing that binds neurotypical people together, and which has these people going, well, I'm not like them, am I? I'm like this. And then you get your tribes, and you get your walls, and then you get your divisions, and then you get your conflict. And this is all supported by zeros and ones.
There's two things I want to ask you. One is, what are you doing these days? And the other one is, how do you see the design and creative world now?
What I'm doing now, I had a period away. I have a son who was born in 2010. He's actually now going to secondary school in Italy, and it's beautiful and it's given me a bit of space. Catherine May, who wrote a beautiful book, the first book I read about being autistic and her discovering it, also wrote a book called Wintering. And wintering is, they say, how are you? I'm fine. How are things? They're great. But they're not always, are they? And we might go into a wintering phase. And when Designer's Block came to an end, I needed to recover. I needed to look into my own mental health. I needed to focus on the things that were important. And you're sort of desperate to come out and say, this is me now. But actually, you need to hibernate. You need to reflect. You need to heal. You need support. You need help. You need to understand what's going on. And for me, in business, we talk about personal well-being. And yet then you're told to leave that at the door and go to work and perform until you break. For me, well-being is foundational for the future. So if we're talking about the future and what I'm looking at, I think partly it's talking to people about how you make your relationship with self better. I talk a lot. I mean, this trinary idea is like, beyond the sort of binary world. So binary is self and other. In this world, there's a relationship self with self and self with other. And what's your relationship with self? When I teach at universities, I do bits running MA at Kingston for part of it. So that's one of the things I do. And I was doing a bit an MA in University of the Arts, which is a super place as well. But you discover that for a lot of the students, the relationship with self was not good. And you realize this is happening a lot. And partly it's because other has told you that there's something wrong with you and you've internalized it. One of my favorite writers in the States, who is writing around South Louisiana, and a lot of it's about male violence and inherited violence and things like this, is James Lee Burke. And he wrote a line in this book. He has these incredible lines. He wrote this line, he said, do we become the person we see reflected in the eyes of the other? And I think when you're told so often that it's your fault, that you're wrong, that you're bad, that you're stupid, that you're making mistakes, it's your fault, do we become the person we see reflected in the eyes of the other? And so often when we don't fit within a system that requires you to sit still, socially conform, read and write, all the things you're required at school, this othering of people who are neurodivergent in that school space is already incredibly damaging. Whenever you read anything about people's lives, they refer to trauma. Trauma exists. And again, it's like when you come up with something that's amazing, people go, what you want about? It's really hard. When I was doing these extraordinary things and people weren't understanding, I said, well, you better justify it then. Or you've got to do that. Or who do you think you are? Well, we'd like you to do something amazing, but we're definitely not going to pay you. Or can you come and tell us loads of your ideas? And then you go, okay, here, generous. And then you go, so will you pay me? So you say, no, we've got everything we need now. You can fuck off. And then they go and take your ideas and run off with them. And you see this happening. And it happened to me. And it was really difficult because you're doing these amazing things and you're trying to support a small team and you can't get the business because you notice this little switch goes off in people's head that goes, you're having a conversation with them, their organization, their whole operation only exists because of ideas you came up with and they find you a bit odd. So that's quite difficult. So I'm coming through with other things. Creativity, I think, is still the most crucial thing that we have to hold on to for the future. But who are going to be coming up with those ideas? I think a lot of people are talking about the threat of AI to creativity, and I'm not a big fan of AI anyway. I mean, I think it has its place in terms of solving various challenges, but I don't think it adequately replaces creativity. And I think that creatives realize that it doesn't. And in fact, creatives are probably the most secure in their work, and carers are possibly more secure in their work because AI isn't going to be good at caring, hasn't got any of the human emotions. And equally, it hasn't lived through those human experiences that you're talking about with your daughter, of, sort of things going wrong and needing to pick yourself up. And that's where the extraordinary stories come from.
But I just read something about this woman and it's creepy. She's decided to program some AI to be like her recently departed husband. So she was able to have one last conversation with him. That sounds awful, but using AI as a proxy for humanity because it's this amalgam of things could trick you, just like the algorithms do, into feeling like you're having a human connection. That's the scary part.
Well, they've not proven to be very good, robot carers or what have you. The tech bros have been telling us for years after years after years that they're going to solve all of our human problems, and they've managed to fail on every single occasion and come back and said, well, if you give us more money and if we use even more resources, we'll end up doing something that might actually feasibly be occasionally useful. And you're kind of like, you've let us down every time in the past. And here you are back again telling us that we need to believe you. And then you're using your position to try to manipulate governments into creating regulatory frameworks that allow them to steal people's creative output. You know that if you feed back information that comes out of an AI machine, the large language model, if you feed that back to the model in order to learn from, within 2 or 3 feedback loops, it creates utter gibberish. If you ask AI to produce a text, it produces a text and you look and go, oh, well, that's really good. In order for the AI to be able to create that information, it needs to be fed with other stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
If what you feed that machine is the output that's come from the machine, within 2 or 3 generations, start creating utter gibberish. So they're employing humans to write answers to questions that will never be seen, because that's what the machine trains upon in order
So the machine can't work without us.
No.
Right.
And obviously there'll be people saying, well, in due course it will be able to. But they keep saying this. And then all this stuff about this trying to create a regulatory framework that says that in order for them not to be allowed to scrape all your information off the internet and use it within its language models, you have to opt out. And they know that people won't opt out because they won't get it, or they're lazy, or what have you. If you had a scheme that said you have to opt in to say you can use my information in order to do it, then nobody would do it, because why would you want them to? But they're then pressuring governments to say the law needs to say that for us not to use somebody's personal information, they need to have advised us through this particular regulatory framework that they don't want us to. It's because they know that they will then have access to far more information because people won't opt out. It's like, reject all cookies or accept all cookies.
Right.
So they're relying upon this, and then they're saying to, like, the UK government, I think Google was saying, and I could be slightly wrong, so don't sue me yet. So that, or there's a suggestion that they're turning around to the government saying, well, do you want us to invest in your country? How about you create the regulatory framework that we want? Now, you know damn well that, this is kind of behind Elon Musk's thing with Trump at the moment. Is he knows that if he can be seen to be the difference between him being a president or him being locked up in jail, Elon Musk can come back and say, right, I want this in return. And we know that this is kind of what's going on, because we know that's how it works. It's always worked that way.
Yeah.
And when people have donated to politicians in order to gain influence and to create the regulatory framework that allows them to make enormous amounts of money, or to gain the contracts we've won, do we trust these guys? The answer is no, of course we don't.
No, yeah.
And you're saying we don't trust Trump, but what about all the people who are waiting for Trump to be in power so they can then get away with what they want?
That's the only reason they're supporting him, because they know he's a complete idiot, and he's definitely not the voice of the future of energy, which is what used to be important to Elon Musk. I know it's very convoluted, but what does this mean for somebody graduating from Central St. Martin's today, for example, or RISD or Parsons?
There's part of me that doesn't know quite so well because I'm not as involved in it. I guess there have been a few things that have slightly shocked me. The generation that I was involved with and came up through Designers Block have done very well, but that's within a tide that's been rising. So, they got going, they created businesses, they've risen. Has the next generation learned all of those lessons? I'm not sure they have, because I think the people that have been successful haven't seen any reason to teach the next generation. Why would they? They're going to keep it to themselves. I don't think colleges are still teaching creativity and entrepreneurship in a way that is as good as it should be, in my view. I think it's still something that you only think about when you leave university. So you're going to university and you don't think you need to deal with that. And then you come out of it and you go, oh my God, I need to do it. Where do I do that?
Like manufacturing and distribution.
Yeah, understanding those relationships, understanding how do creative businesses actually work and what are the different roles and responsibilities. And also I think at university, you're very much encouraged to think about your own ideas, and then you go and say, do you like my idea? Do you like my idea? And one of the things I'm saying to people is that I see more successful businesses coming from people who are good at exploring a need, possibly for a niche, and saying, can we do anything to provide for that? There needs to be a dialogue between different skill sets and mindsets. And that, I guess, is what I'm looking to do within my trinary framework, is to demonstrate how those different segments need to be in dialogue in order to develop an idea till it becomes a really good idea. What's even more interesting is you realize there's something more exciting that's a possibility that you hadn't thought of before. So I talk about an approach-led methodology rather than an outcome-led methodology. An outcome-led is where you marshal the resources and everything stays in a straight line and gets there. Well, that can be seen as the most efficient way of doing things. But what if it blinds you to all the other factors that you would discover? I've now got a role running a unit for an MA at Kingston University, which is about project development in the creative arena. So people have come from different backgrounds. There's going to be Chinese students, Indian students, European students, were there any Brits? There weren't last year. But it's going to be helping them to think through that process. And the unit is essentially a third of their MA. So I'll be leading on that. And that will be teaching them design thinking methodologies, and it will allow for me to come in with my own methodology, the trinary methodology, which I got really nice feedback from last year. And so I'm evolving with that. There's a sort of linear space where everything is fixed and certain, and there's a non-linear space where little differences can make a big difference and where they're challenging and questioning. But we tend to prioritize order, control, certainty, and in an outcome-led, no, make it fit this thing. The classical science says everything is linear, everything is structured, we know this leads to that. But we know in the non-linear space that the butterfly effect, little differences can make a big impact. And in design or in innovation, the little difference can be the difference between it being a fantastic success or it being a complete disaster.
It makes me think of cinema right away, cinematography or tone or lighting, music, all can completely derail a movie or a show. Sometimes it's just that one thing that can completely make or break a story. Sometimes you can't define it, right?
Precisely. But that's the whole point about the non-linear spaces. It's harder to define. People go, can't you define this creativity? And you're going, well, it's pretty difficult. Actually.
This is what I'm talking about, where I find it difficult that you have to have the data. And I've been at agencies where it's like the data. I don't want to hear anything. You have the data behind it. And I think it has to be that kind of liminal space where there's data and then there's intuition and there's a mix. And you have to try things out. Sometimes you have to try things out.
Well, there's a chap called Sidney Brenner who won the Nobel Prize in 2002, and he did this sort of wonderful speech, which is quite famous, called Nature's Gift to Science, which was, if nature didn't have order within it, we wouldn't have a hope of discovering what the order is. He did a line that was basically, we're drowning in data, struggling for knowledge. You can have all the data you like, but you can be overwhelmed by that data. Does it actually tell you anything? How do you interpret it? Have you asked the wrong questions? Sometimes too much data can be a problem. It's almost like a stick with which to beat the people that are working with intuition and feeling. And they're going, well, if you can't back it up with data, you can't do anything. And even I went to University of the Arts and I was saying, look, there's this really interesting thing going on, which is your university is attracting a huge proportion of students who are neurodivergent. So you must be doing something right. But what are you doing right? And you don't know. And they're saying, look, there seems to be a link between creativity, entrepreneurship, and neurodiversity. And they said, well, where's the data? And I said, well, that's what we need to find out. That's what we need to go and explore. Well, if there isn't any data, then we can't do anything, because without the data, because if we're
well, that's how a scientific hypothesis comes about, through observation, and then you go and prove that theory. That's the scientific method, isn't it?
And they're sort of saying, unless
you have a hypothesis,
data, we're not going to check the hypothesis. And I'm like, but that's why we're exploring the hypothesis, is because there's enough good reason to explore the hypothesis based on look at how we're telling the story. You must be doing something right. They see neurodiversity as a problem that needs to be fixed, and they'd like a pill to deal with it. I'm saying a lot of kids are benefiting from an approach to education that you offer at these creative universities that isn't available prior to them getting to university. And for the first time in their lives, they're receiving an educational approach that suits their way of thinking and being. Well, if we understood that and linked that to them being neurodivergent, we would then have a case for taking that type of educational approach to kids that haven't made it to university or who've been excluded from schools or who might benefit. The nonlinear is where we're exploring challenging questions. We then take those insights and we bring them back and go, how does that impact upon our knowledge? Now, the people who are all about certainty and order and control go, can we stop doing all of that questioning? Can we just get on with being forcefully right about what we believe? You're going, no, you still need to spend more time thinking about it. What we're really saying is that there needs to be much more of a relationship between the two, a respect for the two, and understanding of the differences between the two, rather than what we have at the moment, which is that prioritization of let's control and order everything so that everything does as it's told and everything works efficiently. And you're going, the danger of doing that is that you carry on with things that have worked in the past, but probably don't work as well in the present. And then you're using creative skills in order to persuade people that they should still be interested in something that's already long past its sell-by date.
What do you think the world will be like, the creative world, in the next 10, 20 years? What are some things that you see coming for the creative industries and just creative people in general?
Creativity is often a response to shifts going on in the wider world. When I was talking about designer's block emerging from within that social context, the social context that we're looking at now is one where there's a growing sense that we could be facing quite significant catastrophes. And whether that's because of our actions, that these things are now coming back to bite us, our actions are creating a more volatile world. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. This is growing in the world. When communism failed, there was this belief that, oh, great, everything's going to commit to being capitalism and democracy. And then 2008 comes along and it shows that that doesn't work either. So we're left with this void. I think that we need creativity to think not just about nice things. It's going to need to be employed to think through very complex challenges where ambiguity is part of it. You can't deal with ambiguity without exploring the subtleties. And you need creative people to do that. The danger of being too linear and forced into repeating what we've been doing in the past is its capacity to just shatter. And if you look at the financial sector, it's like, no, we carry on, no, nothing to see here. And then it shatters. There's somebody who's saying, how do disasters happen? And they said, slowly to start with, and then very, very fast. And I think more and more people are concerned that the system doesn't work very well. Where's the imagination for how we're going to organise society in future? We're talking a little bit about what got me a little bit fed up with designer's block. To start, it was this new way of producing stuff and the new types of things with conscious consumption. It was like, let's buy something that's really nice, not too often, and it will last. It will last in the imagination, it will last physically. Then consumerism came along, just swallowed it all up. And then you're back to the too much stuff. I mean, you can produce beautifully designed clothing, but what if it's destroying the planet? It's not good. So the challenges that we're facing now and the vulnerabilities that we're facing now are coming at us in all sorts of directions. You know, we know that we can't consume this way. The planet is biting back. We're going to have wars about water before too long. When people don't have access to water, you're going to see migrations happening with hundreds of millions of people wandering across. I think it's pretty scary. And I know that that's not what everybody wants to see. I mean, I was in Italy and I was looking at this sort of shopping mall, and you just see all these people wandering about just buying more stuff. And, you know, the plastic card still works. You just tap it and then you go away. And they're only buying sort of grey, black and blue. It's like, it's exactly what they're wearing already. Why do you need more? Why are we doing this? What is it that has us believe that somehow this is like in any way sustainable? We're still being fed the same old solutions for not feeling great about ourselves and then going to buy more stuff and then discovering that the satisfaction lasts for even less time and then we've got even more shoes in the cupboard. A lot of marketing starts with not what's the need and how can we provide for that, but how do we manufacture in people's minds the sense that they're failing and therefore they need this thing that we can then provide them as a solution.
Manufacturing consent.
Yeah. And that's been done by creative industries in lots of ways as well. There's nothing about creativity that's great if it's being used to simply forward behaviors that are so destructive in the longer term.
What can we turn our creativity and joie de vivre about beautiful things towards without killing it?
We need community rather than consumerism. And you're living in the land of the individual. And for me, this sort of fetishization of we are individual and the freedom of the individual has actually made us incredibly vulnerable to the marketing of organizations that know how to prey upon us. We just don't need all of that, but we do need connections. We do need that.
I agree.
Again, the tech bros will use tech in order to solve all the health problems. Well, you won't. What you need for health is sleep, diet, exercise, and then connections and spirituality.
I went camping with my kids last weekend, and the feeling I got was one of almost ecstasy, just lying on a hammock looking up at the trees. It felt like the same or better feeling than when I'm looking at a beautiful thing that somebody has made. This is better than a 5-star hotel. We're just had a little tent and a little fire. That's all we needed.
Got a 5,000-star hotel and you're sleeping under the sky. But isn't it crazy?
Yeah.
We created a safe city by filling it full of sodium lights, and now you can't see the stars. But our whole sort of journey into wonder and exploration and understanding of the questions and all of that beautiful stuff over hundreds and thousands of years came from looking at the stars. Now you can't even see them. We've all been enclosed in this sort of shield, obscuring everything that really matters. We need to think creatively around how we re-engage with ourselves.
You've been listening to Actual People. This show is written, directed, and executive produced by me, your host, Chauncey Zalkin. Show sound designed by Eric Aaron.